They were left with no name, no collar, and no reason to survive. Just two small lives curled in the snow, forgotten by the world, remembered only by each other. But what if I told you? One silent moment changed everything. At Valor Tails, we don't just tell stories. We uncover the truths buried beneath fur and silence. Tales of love lost, loyalty tested, and hearts that keep beating long after they've been broken. Today's video holds a lesson so quietly powerful, you may not even realize it's healing you until the final frame. So, watch closely. Stay with us. Because some stories aren't heard. They're felt. And this one just might remind you of something you thought you'd forgotten. It was the kind of cold that seeped through bone. Snow had been falling in sheets since early afternoon, and by the time the highway patrol car crept along Route 39 just outside Aspen Falls, the world had gone white. Headlights struggled against the curtain of snow, barely revealing the ditch that had swallowed up an old truck tire, a crumpled fast food bag, and two small figures huddled together beneath a broken street sign. They almost didn't see them, but the flash of black fur against snow made the deputy slam the brakes. And when she stepped out, squinting through the storm, she realized what she was looking at. Two puppies. One was jet black with a bright white patch on his chest, curled tightly in a protective circle around the other, a golden-furred brother, eyes barely open, legs trembling. Both were soaked to the skin, their small bodies pressed so tightly together you couldn't tell where one began and the other ended. "Hey there, easy," the deputy whispered, crouching low. The black pup didn't growl. He didn't bark. He just looked up, his eyes so dark, so unnervingly calm, as if he'd already seen more than he should have in this life. That night, the brothers were rushed to Trail Haven Rescue, a small, private shelter tucked into the foothills of Colorado. Trail Haven didn't have fancy facilities or shiny lobby counters, but it had warmth and a woman named Marla Quinn who had a way with lost things. Marla was in her 50s, wore denim-like armor, and carried a sadness she didn't talk about. Her only son had enlisted 10 years ago and never really came back, not in the way that counted. So she poured her time into the dogs, especially the broken ones, especially the quiet ones. She met the puppies wrapped in fleece blankets, laid side by side in the back of the deputy's SUV. The golden one, already named Scout by the officer, shivered and whimpered softly. The black one remained still, unmoving, except for the rise and fall of his chest. No whimper, no protest. "Got yourself a stoic one," Marla muttered, running a hand over his damp fur. She called him Ranger. Something about him, how he'd shielded his brother in that ditch, how he watched people like he was assessing whether they deserved to be near him, reminded her of the service dogs her son used to work with. That first night, she kept them together in the back kennel where it was warmest. Scout whimpered in his sleep. Ranger stayed curled around him, refusing food, refusing water, refusing to close his eyes. He didn't bark. Not once. The days passed. Scout recovered quickly, eating well, wagging his tail, licking every hand that reached for him. But Ranger stayed silent. When volunteers passed by, he didn't leap up or press against the cage like the others. He simply watched, eyes dark and searching. If someone called his name, he would blink slowly. If someone held out a treat, he wouldn't move. It wasn't fear. It wasn't aggression. It was something else. Stillness. One morning, Marla came in early to do a quick check before a vet visit. Scout was scheduled for his first set of vaccines, and she wanted to get him cleaned up. "Come on, sweetheart," she cooed, slipping into the pen. Scout wagged his tail and licked her hand. Marla bent to lift him, he wasn't very heavy, and turned to carry him toward the door. That's when it happened. Behind her, a shift in the air. Not loud, not dramatic, just the sound of nails on concrete, slow and deliberate. Ranger had stood up, the first time since arriving. Marla turned slowly. Ranger wasn't growling. He wasn't pacing or whining or biting at the bars. He just walked over to the corner of the kennel, silent as a whisper, and picked up something small from the pile of donated towels. A handkerchief. Old, faded, ivory white. Embroidered in dark thread near the corner were two initials, W+H. He carried it gently in his mouth, brought it to the gate, and placed it at Marla's feet. Then he looked up, eyes still and searching. Marla froze. She crouched down, picked up the cloth. It was soft and smelled faintly of lavender and thyme. "Where'd you get this, huh?" she asked softly. Ranger didn't move, just kept watching her. She glanced over her shoulder, toward the file folders stacked on the office desk. No donor named W or H had dropped off linens recently. No tag on that towel pile mentioned initials. No one had claimed this. Marla ran her fingers along the stitching. It was hand-sewn, carefully, lovingly, not something you'd just toss away. "You're holding on to something, aren't you?" she whispered, more to herself than the pup. Ranger blinked once, then turned and walked slowly back to the mat he shared with Scout, curling up in the exact same place back to the door, body curled as if still trying to shield something he couldn't protect anymore. Marla stood there for a long moment, the cloth in her hand. She didn't say anything at first, but later, when the vet arrived and asked about the two pups, she gestured toward Ranger. "He doesn't bark, doesn't growl, doesn't jump." She paused. "But the way he looks at you, it's like he remembers someone who already left." She placed the folded handkerchief into a plastic bag and labeled it, just in case. Blush. No one at the shelter would know what it meant. Not yet. But Ranger did. And for now, that was enough. It happened on a Thursday. The morning sun had barely stretched its fingers across the frost-tipped hills when Marla pulled into the gravel lot of Trail Haven. Steam rose from her travel mug as she stepped into the office, boots leaving soft prints on the linoleum. The kennels were quiet, save for a few early risers offering muffled yawns and tail thumps. Scout was already up. He sat by the gate of his pen, tail sweeping eagerly, tongue lolling from his mouth like a kid waiting for recess. Ranger, as always, lay still, pressed against the far corner, his head resting on the same faded towel where he kept the handkerchief. W+H remained, tucked carefully beneath his chin, like a secret he refused to let go of. Marla moved through her morning routine, feeding, water checks, kennel cleaning. She greeted each dog, murmuring names and praises like a prayer. When she reached the last pen, she stopped. There, waiting at the gate, was a woman in a beige sweater, holding a clipboard and a latte. Beside her stood a little boy in a red puffer jacket, maybe 6 years old, his mittened hands gripping the fence with excitement. Behind them, a man early 30s, buzz cut, navy peacoat scanned the kennel with the calculated eye of someone who'd researched every breed on the internet before arriving. They were here to adopt. "Looking for someone playful," the woman said brightly. "Good with kids, you know? Friendly." Marla offered a polite smile. "Most of ours are. But let's take a look." May. Scout caught their attention instantly. His golden coat, still slightly scruffy, shimmered under the overhead lights. He barked once just enough to say hello, then trotted up to the fence and wagged his entire body. The boy laughed. "I want that one." Marla felt the knot form in her chest. She opened the gate, stepped inside, and scooped Scout up. He was light and wriggly, licking her cheek with complete trust. He didn't know. Ranger lifted his head slowly. He blinked once, then twice, then stood up. It was the first time he had moved toward the front of the kennel since arriving. He didn't bark. He didn't lunga. He didn't whine. He simply walked forward, placing himself in the narrow space between Marla and the exit. His body was still. His ears were down. His head hung slightly. But his eyes locked onto hers. Marla paused. "Easy, sweetheart," she murmured. "He's just going to a good home. You'll see him again, maybe." Ranger didn't move. Scout wagged his tail, oblivious, licking the boy's mitten through the gate. Marla took a step forward. Ranger held his ground. The woman outside laughed, unaware. "He's trying to protect his brother. That's so cute." But Marla wasn't smiling. This wasn't cute. This was something else. Something deeper. A cil pli, a line drawn in the concrete. She knelt slowly and reached out. Ranger lowered his gaze, then, slowly, turned his body to the side, letting her pass. But as she carried Scout through the gate, He did not follow. He did not watch. He returned to the corner, took the towel with the embroidered handkerchief in his mouth, and pulled it close. Then he curled his body over it like a mother guarding her young. Scout yipped from outside, distracted by the falling snow. The gate shut behind them. Ranger didn't lift his head again. That evening, Marla returned late from dropping off adoption paperwork. Scout's new family had been kind, excited, warm, and prepared. She had every reason to feel good about it. But her heart sat heavy. She stepped into the kennel and paused at Ranger's gate. He was still in the corner. He hadn't moved. His food bowl remained full, untouched. Water still shimmered in the silver dish. "Hey, buddy," she whispered, unlocking the gate and kneeling beside him. No response. She placed a gentle hand on his back. He didn't flinch, but he didn't lean in either. "Don't do this," she said, voice cracking. "I know it hurts." Ranger remained still. She reached for the handkerchief, just barely visible beneath his paw. He shifted, ever so slightly, covering it more completely. Marla sat down beside him. Minutes passed. Outside, the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long blue shadows into the kennel. "You know," she said softly, "some dogs wait for people. But you," she exhaled, "you're waiting for something you already lost." She stayed until the hall lights dimmed. Then she stood, brushing off her jeans. "I'll be back in the morning," she promised. "You don't have to come out, but I'll be here." As she turned to leave, she glanced back one last time. Ranger hadn't moved, but his eyes had followed her, quietly, steadily, watching, not with anger, not with fear, just waiting for someone who wouldn't return, waiting for a brother who didn't know he'd been left behind. And for the first time in years, Marla felt something old and familiar tug at the back of her throat, a grief she thought she'd buried. One she suddenly shared with a black-furred pup who didn't bark, didn't fight, didn't run. He just remembered. The wind had shifted, carrying the smell of cedar and melting ice. But Walter Evans barely noticed. He sat stiffly in the passenger seat of his granddaughter's Subaru, his gloved hands resting on a cane that he didn't actually need to walk just to feel balanced in a world that had tilted sideways after Helen died. The drive from his quiet two-bedroom in Westfield to the hills outside of town had taken nearly 30 minutes, but it had felt much longer. Eileen kept glancing sideways at him, chewing nervously on her bottom lip. Her music was turned down low, some kind of indie folk stuff, but it couldn't cover the silence stretching between them. Walter finally grumbled, "You didn't have to bring me out here." Eileen didn't look at him. "You haven't left the house in 3 weeks, Grandpa." "I've been fine," he muttered. "You talk to the vacuum cleaner like it's Grandma." His brow twitched, but he didn't respond. She wasn't wrong. They pulled into the gravel lot outside Trailhaven Rescue, where the slanted wooden sign squeaked slightly in the wind. The building looked like it belonged more to a park ranger than an animal shelter. Low, rustic, with green trim and a tiny front porch. It wasn't what Walter had expected. Eileen parked, hopped out, and opened his door before he could protest again. "Just look," she said. "No pressure. Just look." Walter didn't want a dog. Didn't need one. He'd spent 37 years training canines for the military, and he knew the heartbreak of attachment. He'd sworn off all of it after Helen passed. The house was too quiet. Sure, but it was safely quiet. Predictable. Still, he followed Eileen up the ramp, boots crunching over salt and half-melted snow. Inside, a soft bell rang over the door. The front room was warm and smelled faintly of oatmeal soap and kibble. A woman in a denim jacket behind the desk glanced up. "You must be Eileen," she said. "And this must be Mr. Evans." "Walter," he corrected. "Don't sir me." Marla smiled gently. "Fair enough. Come on back." They passed through the hallway into the back kennels. Dogs barked as they approached high-pitched yaps, deep woofs, and the occasional excited scratch of paws against wire. Marla stopped in front of a row near the end and gestured toward a corner pen. "He's not like the others," she said. "Quiet. Doesn't really respond to much. But something tells me he's still listening." Walter stepped forward and looked inside. A black dog medium size, lean, Fur matted just a little around the ears lay curled tightly in the corner of the pen. His head rested on what looked like a faded towel, his paws tucked close. One ear twitched as Walter shifted his cane, but the dog didn't move. "Name's Ranger," Marla added. "Came in with his brother. The other pup got adopted last week." Walter felt something tighten in his chest. Eileen nudged him forward gently. "Say hi." He cleared his throat. "Hello there." No reaction. Walter stared for a moment longer, then did something he hadn't planned. He crouched. His knees popped in protest, but he dropped slowly until he was eye level with the dog. "Don't suppose you're interested in an old man who talks to himself." Ranger stirred. Just barely. His eyes blinked once. Then he lifted his head. Walter froze. The dog didn't bark, didn't whine. He stood slowly and walked across the pen. Not quickly, not excitedly, just purposefully, quietly. And then, with delicate grace, he pressed his head into Walter's knee. Walter didn't move. Couldn't. His hands trembled slightly, though he wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the heat of that small body. Maybe it was the way the dog didn't demand anything, just rested there, solid and present. After a long pause, Walter whispered, "He's not afraid of me." "No," Eileen said softly from behind. "I think he sees something familiar." Walter swallowed hard. He felt it too, a strange gravity, an understanding between creatures who had both lost things. They stayed that way, man and dog, silence and breath, for almost a minute. Then Ranger did something else. He turned, padded to the back of the pen, and picked up a small cloth from the towel pile. He carried it back in his mouth, gentle as a whisper, and dropped it at Walter's feet. Walter blinked. A handkerchief, white, frayed at the edges, and stitched with 2 letters, W+H. His heart stopped. He reached for it with trembling fingers, lifting it into the light. The stitching was slightly uneven, but unmistakable. The thread was dark green, the exact shade Helen had used when she made handkerchiefs for their first anniversary. It couldn't be the same one. That was impossible. She'd embroidered several back in their early days, back when he was deployed, and she needed something to keep her hands busy. One of them had gone missing after her funeral, during the packing. He'd searched for it for weeks, before giving up. His breath caught in his throat. Eileen stepped closer. "Grandpa, are you okay?" Walter stared at the cloth, then at Ranger, then back at the cloth. He couldn't speak. Ranger didn't move, just sat there, eyes focused, still and deep and calm. Marla's voice broke the silence. "We never figured out where he got that. None of the towels donated had initials. None of us embroidered it." Walter stood slowly. "Helen made one exactly like this, 40 years ago." Marla blinked. "You're sure?" He nodded. "She always used green thread. Said it was lucky." No one spoke for a while. Finally, Eileen whispered, "Maybe it is." Walter looked down at Ranger. The dog gazed back up, not wagging his tail, not licking, just being there. A steady presence. A quiet yes. Walter cleared his throat, the handkerchief still clenched in his hand. "I didn't come here to take anything home." Eileen didn't push. She didn't need to. But as Walter stood there, an old man in a weathered coat, holding a cloth from a lifetime ago, he knew. Some things found their way back, even when you weren't looking. The house was quiet, like always. The gravel crunched under Walter's boots as he pulled up into the driveway. Ranger sat calmly in the back seat of the car, eyes alert, head tilted slightly, as if absorbing every detail: the wind through the pine trees, the creak of the mailbox, the faded wreath still hanging from last winter. Walter opened the door and gave a soft pat on the seat. "Go on. Welcome home." Ranger didn't hesitate. He jumped down without a sound, landing with grace, and walked straight to the porch. Not sniffing around like a curious pup, not darting like a dog overwhelmed by a new place, just walking. Deliberate, steady. Walter paused on the porch step, watching him. "You act like you've been here before," he muttered. Ranger didn't look back. The door creaked open, and the smell of old wood, faint dust, and something floral, maybe lingering lavender, greeted them both. Walter hadn't changed much in the house since Helen passed. Her favorite mug still sat on the window ledge above the sink. Her shawl still hung on the hook by the back door. Her knitting basket remained tucked under the side table near the recliner. That recliner, it had been her spot. Right-hand side of the fireplace, cushion slightly more worn than the others, a thin imprint in the backrest that never quite faded. And that's exactly where Ranger went. Without sniffing, without circling, without testing the couch or the rug or the other chairs. He walked straight to the recliner and sat beside it. Then slowly, he laid down, pressing his side against the base of the chair, his head resting just under the armrest, like he knew someone used to be there. Walter stood frozen in the doorway. One hand still gripped the knob, the other pressed absently against his chest. He didn't say anything, didn't need to. He walked slowly into the kitchen, flipped on the kettle like always, and stared out the window. Ranger didn't follow. He just stayed where he was silent, still, like a memory. Walter returned with tea and settled into the recliner across the room, the one he never liked as much, the one that still didn't feel right. The old radio on the side table still worked, though it took a few knocks. When it finally crackled to life, it played static for a beat then. Through the soft fuzz of the speaker, a familiar tune began to play. Moon River. Walter's hand froze midair. It was her song. Helen used to hum it under her breath while cooking. She'd sing it fully only at night, curled up in that exact chair, when she thought he wasn't listening. Her voice was never perfect, but it always felt like home. As the first verse drifted through the room, something extraordinary happened. Ranger, who had been resting quietly, lifted his head. He didn't bark. He didn't look toward the window or the door. He looked up at the ceiling, and then, ever so gently, he let out a soft, low whine. Not distressed, not urgent, just a sound, a release. Walter stared at him. He'd seen dogs do strange things over the years, especially those trained for search and rescue. But this felt different. This wasn't a learned behavior. This wasn't instinct. This was recognition. Ranger settled again, head resting on the same spot beneath the armrest, eyes half closed, body utterly still except for the rise and fall of his breath. And Walter, who had held back tears for months, through condolences, through memorials, through endless casseroles and empty nights, finally let go. It started with a tremble, then a single sob, then another. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead to his knees, shoulders shaking as the song played on. Ranger didn't move. He just stayed there, like a shadow, like a ghost, like someone who had shown up not to replace but to remind. Walter whispered through the cracking of his voice. "Helen, you're at it again, aren't you?" His fingers found the handkerchief in his pocket, the one Ranger had brought him at the shelter. The embroidery was still intact, faded but firm. W+H. The house felt full in a way it hadn't in a long time. Not busy, not noisy, but present. Later that evening, after the radio had gone silent and the tea had gone cold, Walter stood and stretched his back with a grunt. Ranger lifted his head but didn't get up. "You hungry?" Walter asked. "Let's find you something." He shuffled into the bedroom, opened the old dresser drawers, and pulled out a wool sweater, Helen's. She used to wear it on cold mornings when she'd cook pancakes and hum whatever song she'd dreamt about the night before. Walter brought it back into the living room and laid it across the recliner. Ranger immediately stood, walked over, and sniffed it. Then, with almost reverent care, he grasped the sleeve in his mouth, not tugging, not chewing, just holding it. And then, in a move so natural it sent a fresh chill down Walter's spine, Ranger padded slowly into the kitchen and dropped the sweater beside the oven, right where Helen used to stand. Walter leaned in the doorway, watching him. "No one showed you that," he said under his breath. Ranger sat by the sweater, facing the stove, not begging, not waiting for scraps, just sitting, as if remembering, as if someone else had been here before and had never really left. Walter swallowed. He crossed the room, knelt beside the dog, and rested a trembling hand on his back. "All right," he whispered. "I get it." The lights buzzed overhead. The heater ticked as it worked to keep the chill at bay. And somewhere inside that house, beneath floorboards, between cracks in the walls, echoes stirred. Not haunting, but healing. The sky lit up in bursts of red and gold, crackling against the night like artillery fire. Walter sat stiffly on the edge of the porch, one hand gripping his cane, the other clutching a sweating glass of iced tea. It was the 4th of July, and neighbors 2 blocks down had started early with their fireworks. The show wasn't sanctioned, not really legal, but in this part of Colorado, rules had a way of bending in the name of tradition. A pop echoed in the distance, then a second one, louder, sharper. Ranger bolted upright from where he had been dozing at Walter's feet. His ears shot back, his legs trembled. Then came the third blast, closer, sudden, splitting the sky above them with a flash of electric blue. Ranger let out a yelp, not loud but wounded, his body hunched low to the porch, muscles coiled. Then, without warning, he scrambled under the wooden bench, trying to wedge his body into the smallest space he could find. His sides heaved. He whimpered once, then buried his face into the crook of his front paws. Walter blinked, frozen, because his heart was doing the same thing, because his breath had caught at the sound of that pop, not because it was loud, but because it had transported him to a desert, to a convoy, to the moment in 1971, when his partner went left, and he went right, and only one of them made it home. He didn't remember standing, but suddenly he was kneeling next to Ranger, one hand hovering just above the dog's trembling back. "I know," he whispered. "I know, boy." It took several minutes for Ranger's breathing to slow, for his body to soften. Walter stayed beside him the entire time, murmuring nonsense old military cadences, the words to a song Helen once sang, anything to anchor them both. By the time the fireworks stopped, the night had deepened into a heavy, starlit stillness. Ranger crept out from beneath the bench, but didn't go far. He laid next to Walter, eyes wide open, body pressed close. Inside, the clock chimed 10. The next morning, Eileen stopped by with groceries and found them both in the same position. Walter on the porch bench, Ranger curled at his feet. She noticed the look in her grandfather's eyes, the way he didn't speak for the first few minutes, the way his hand occasionally twitched, like he was still gripping a rifle. "You okay?" she asked, unloading cereal boxes onto the kitchen counter. Walter didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "He doesn't like fireworks." Eileen glanced through the window. "A lot of dogs don't." "It's not just fear," Walter muttered. "It's something else." Eileen came closer. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" Walter nodded. He made a few calls that week. Quiet ones. Pulled some strings. An old buddy from Fort Carson still had access to canine service records, even for the rejects. It took some time, but eventually an envelope arrived in the mail. Ranger. Real name. Bravo 9. Ranger had been in training at a specialized K-9 military unit in Texas, scored high on scent detection, even higher on obedience. But he was pulled from the program after a critical event. Walter scanned the typed summary. Removed from active duty consideration. Displays hyperattachment to fellow trainee. Exhibited signs of extreme distress when separated. Unfit for high-pressure, autonomous operations. He read it 3 times. "He failed," he said aloud, then paused. No, he didn't fail. He just felt too much. Later that week, Walter took Ranger to the local vet for his scheduled booster shots. Dr. Sanchez had been treating animals in that town for over 20 years and knew how to read more than just symptoms. "He doesn't like loud sounds, huh?" she asked as she finished checking Ranger's heartbeat. "No," Walter said. "Neither do I." She smiled gently. "Ever notice how he responds to commands?" Walter nodded. "He listens, never disobeys. But there's something else." Dr. Sanchez walked over to her file drawer, pulled out a laminated card, and returned with a clicker. She gave Walter a sideways glance. "Try this," she said. "Say the command, search, Home. Clear and firm. Walter raised an eyebrow but obliged. Search home. Ranger's ears perked. Then, astonishingly, he stood and walked straight to the door. Not confused, not distracted. He sat, facing the front exit, tail low, body alert. Dr. Sanchez's voice softened. That's a K-9 directive. It means, go find the missing person. Bring them back. Walter stared at the dog. But there's no one out there. Ranger didn't move, just kept sitting. Still, waiting. The air in the room changed. Grief slipped in like a draft. Back home, that evening, Walter sat in his recliner with Ranger curled at his feet. The old man didn't speak for a while, just watched the light change across the floorboards. Then, without prompting, Ranger stood. He walked to the far corner of the room where his towel lay. He nudged it once, then picked up something gently in his mouth. The handkerchief, the one with the faded green thread. W+H. He patted across the room and dropped it, without flourish, right in front of Walter's feet. Then he sat, waiting. Walter stared at the cloth, at the initials, at the stillness of the dog who had carried it. And the meaning clicked. This wasn't a gift. It was a reminder. A message not shouted, but known. You're still looking, aren't you? So am I. Walter picked up the handkerchief slowly. The stitching was almost threadbare now, but the letters still held. He cleared his throat. I thought I was rescuing him, he whispered. His voice cracked. But maybe he's pulling me out of where I buried myself. He leaned down and rested a hand on Ranger's head. The dog closed his eyes. They stayed like that for a long while. Man and dog. Two souls. One grief. One mission still unfinished. To come home again. The call came on a gray Tuesday morning. Walter had just finished pouring himself a cup of coffee, black, no sugar, just like always when the landline rang. He nearly didn't answer it. Nobody called the landline anymore except telemarketers or his insurance agent. But something nudged him. He picked up on the third ring. Yeah? It was Marla. Her voice was quieter than usual, layered with fatigue and something else concern. Walter, she said, you might want to sit down. I already am, he replied. Though he wasn't. She exhaled. It's Scout. He's back. Walter frowned. Back? What do you mean, back? The family who adopted him returned him this morning, she said carefully. They said he was too much, too energetic, too vocal. Said he kept them up at night, wouldn't settle, wouldn't play with the kids. He tore up the curtains and clawed the door every time they tried to crate him. Walter rubbed a hand over his face. He's just a puppy. I know, she said gently. But that's not the worst part. What is? Marla hesitated. Since he got back, he hasn't made a sound. Not a bark, not a tail wag. He keeps turning his back to the door, lying in the same corner of the kennel, just like his brother did. Walter closed his eyes. Marla continued. He remembers Walter. He remembers Ranger, and I think he misses him. Maybe more than we thought. Walter didn't answer right away. He stood at the window, watching as Ranger nosed through the garden with lazy curiosity, tail twitching, something twisted in his chest. He's not sleeping much either, Marla added. Scout, I mean. He whines low sometimes, but only when he thinks no one's listening. A long pause. I thought you should know. Walter hung up the phone a minute later and stared at the wall. His eyes landed on Helen's old calendar still hanging by the fridge. She had marked the 4th of July in red pen every year, no matter what. That date had passed just last week. By Thursday afternoon, Walter pulled into Trailhaven with the same quiet dread as the first time. Eileen hadn't come with him this time. She had a shift at the hospital, and truthfully, Walter didn't know how she'd feel about what he was about to do. Marla met him out front, arms folded, lips pressed together in a thin line. He's in the last kennel, she said. Same spot as before. Walter nodded. He didn't speak until he reached the gate. And there he was. Scout, sitting motionless in the corner of the kennel, his golden coat dulled slightly by stress and dust. He didn't react when Walter approached, didn't lift his head, but his eyes shifted just barely. Enough to see, enough to know. Walter crouched down slowly, His knees popped in protest, but he ignored them. "Hey, kiddo," he said, voice low. "Long time." Scout didn't move. Walter reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a ragged corner of cloth, the W+H handkerchief. He placed it gently on the floor, just inside the gate. Ranger had carried it once. Maybe now it would speak to Scout too. The pup's ears flicked. Then, slowly, cautiously, Scout stood. He stepped forward, one hesitant paw at a time, sniffed the cloth, and then let out the smallest, quietest whine Walter had ever heard. That was all it took. "I'll take him home," Walter said to Marla without looking up. They belonged together, but not everyone agreed. That evening, Walter's son David showed up, unannounced, his car tires crunching the gravel with agitation, his coat still draped over one shoulder, and a line between his eyebrows deep enough to cut glass. "2 dogs?" David snapped before even walking inside. "Dad? Seriously?" Walter glanced over his shoulder. He was in the living room, easing Scout onto a second blanket near Ranger's favorite spot. David walked in and gestured toward the dogs. "What happens if you fall, huh? If one of them pulls too hard and you hit the ground? You're 72. You live alone." "They don't pull," Walter replied calmly. "You don't know that. I do now." David threw his coat onto a chair. "You want 1 dog? Fine. That's companionship. That's manageable. But 2, that's chaos." "They're brothers," Walter said. "That's not your problem." Walter turned to face him. David's eyes softened for a moment, then hardened again. "Look, I know you miss Mom, we all do. But these dogs aren't her. They're not going to fix that." Walter flinched just barely. David stepped forward, voice gentler now. "Dad, she's not coming back, no matter how many dogs you bring into this house." Walter sat down slowly in his chair. Ranger moved to his side. Scout sat just inches from his brother, tail tucked under. "I know," Walter said finally. His voice cracked. "I know they'll never be your mother." David blinked, caught off guard. Walter continued slowly. "But when she died, I lost more than her. I lost mornings. I lost coffee that mattered. I lost the reason I got out of bed." The silence between them swelled, heavy and hard. Walter looked down at the dogs. "Ranger gave me that reason again. A heartbeat. A rhythm." He exhaled. "And maybe Scout. Maybe he's still looking for his." David stood still. The old man's words hung in the air like incense. Scout laid his head across Ranger's back. Eyes finally closed. For the first time since coming home, he looked at peace. Walter reached out and stroked both heads with the same hand. "They're not a replacement," he whispered. "They're a reminder that I'm still alive." David didn't speak again. He looked at his father, really looked, then slowly nodded. "I'll bring more kibble next week," he said quietly, then turned and walked out. Walter watched the door close behind him, then turned back to the dogs. "You boys hungry?" he asked. Scout wagged his tail. It was a soft morning, the kind of morning Helen used to call gentle light. Mist clung low across the yard, and the air smelled faintly of pine needles and old rain. Birds hadn't fully woken, and the sky was still deciding whether to turn blue or stay gray. Scout stood on the porch, paws planted firmly, eyes locked on the screen door. Inside, Ranger lifted his head. No sound passed between them. No bark, no yelp, no scramble of paws. Ranger rose slowly, walked to the door, and nudged it open with his snout. And there, just under the frame, the 2 brothers met. There was no chaos, no jumping, no wild tail wagging. Scout lowered his head slightly. Ranger did the same. Then, gently, they touched foreheads, quiet, steady, like a memory settling into place. After that, Scout stepped in. Ranger walked beside him, side by side, as if they'd never been parted. As if the weeks, the miles, and the heartbreak were just background noise to something far older and deeper, the bond they were born into. They padded into the living room, curled up beneath the window, and laid down. Together, Walter stood in the hallway, watching them. He didn't move for a long time. His chest was tight, not from sorrow, but from something harder to name, something heavier and somehow warmer, a realization that some wounds didn't need to close to stop hurting. They just needed company. Later that afternoon, Eileen stopped by with groceries and fresh coffee. She was halfway through unbagging apples when she noticed Walter wasn't in the kitchen. She found him out back. It was the first time he'd been there in over 2 years. The patio had gone untouched since Helen passed. Her old wicker chair still sat beneath the grape arbor, its cushion faded by sun and seasons. Her basket of knitting yarn had been moved indoors long ago, but Walter could still picture her sitting there, murmuring to herself, twisting wool into scarves that never seemed to end. Now, Walter sat in her chair, one leg crossed over the other, mug of tea in hand. Scout was on one side of him, head resting on his foot. Ranger was on the other, pressed close, calm as ever. Eileen stepped outside, quiet as a breeze. "You haven't sat out here since?" Walter nodded. "Since..." She wiped at her cheek and chuckled through the tears. "You know," she said, voice shaking slightly, "Grandma would probably complain Scout's stealing her spot." Walter smiled. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the old cloth. The handkerchief, W+H.M. The letters were nearly gone now, thread worn thin from being carried and gripped and laid down in moments of meaning. Ranger looked up as Walter unfolded it. Then, slowly, the black-furred dog stood, walked a few steps forward, and did what he'd done twice before. He picked it up, not with force, not as a trick, but with something almost sacred, and he placed it gently into Walter's lap, right next to Helen's favorite mug, still chipped at the rim. Walter's eyes didn't water this time. They simply softened. Eileen sat on the step and watched the three of them, grandfather and his 2 companions, gathered beneath the arbor like something ancient and still. For a long time, no one spoke. Then Walter exhaled, low, deep, from the soul. "There are wounds," he murmured, "that never quite heal." Eileen looked up at him. He wasn't sad, just honest. He sipped his tea, scratched both dogs behind the ears, then added, almost to himself, "But sometimes a soul finds its way to you. And it doesn't try to fix you. It just lies beside you, stays with you." He paused, "and lets you carry the wound without having to carry it alone." Eileen's breath hitched. She stood, wiped her face, and kissed the top of his head. "You're not alone, Grandpa." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Later, when the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched across the lawn, Walter remained in the chair. The handkerchief lay across his thigh. Ranger and Scout, side by side, curled beneath him. The house was quiet, but not empty. Not anymore. He looked at the yard, at the light filtering through the leaves, at the fading imprint of where Helen once sat every Sunday morning humming Moon River and sipping her chamomile. He whispered, "Helen, you were right." A pause. Then softer still. Again, like always. "If you've made it this far, thank you." Because stories like this one, about broken hearts, lost companions, and silent healing aren't told for fame or clicks. They're told because someone somewhere needs to hear them. Ranger and Scout may have been born into abandonment, but they found their way into something greater than rescue. They found home. And Walter, a man who thought his story had ended, discovered it was just beginning again through 2 quiet souls who never asked for anything but stayed through everything. As the old saying goes, sometimes the only way forward is through the love of something that cannot speak, but always understands. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to Valor Tails. Your support, every like, every comment, every new subscriber, helps us reach our dream of 5,000 hearts, connected by compassion. It's what fuels us to keep sharing these meaningful, real-life parables. And if you believe the world needs more kindness, more courage, and more second chances, then you're already part of our story. Until next time, stay soft, stay strong,